All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. Thank you very much for attending tonight's event, which is in fact the final installment of the CCAS Spring Series on Revolution in the Arab World, the long view. And I can vouch that we are going out in style with the series, because today we have two stellar specialists and scholars of North Africa. We will have them, I will introduce them both at once, and they will, in the order in which they are presenting. First, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Lahouari Addi, who will be presenting a talk entitled The Crisis of Authoritarian Rule in North Africa. Professor Addi is currently Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Political Studies at the University of Lyon in France, where he teaches political sociology of the Arab States and anthropology of the Middle East. He has several publications in French and in English, all of them related to North African societies, to political Islam, and the process of democratization. He recently wrote, no, this is not recent, but among his publications are L'Algérie et la démocratie, les mutations de la société algérienne, Sociologie, antropologie chez Pierre Bourdieu, Geertz, Culture, Interprétation. This is the translation, right, of Geertz, which is by itself a feat, right? And his forthcoming book in English is a comparison between Gellner and Geertz about North Africa. He also has publications in the Journal of Democracy, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. He was a Fulbright Scholar at the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University in 1992, and a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton in 2003. He was also a visiting professor at the University of Utah at Salt Lake City in 1997, and at UCLA Los Angeles in 2007. And our second speaker will be Professor Ali Abdul Latif Ahmida. And again, it's my greatest pleasure to welcome him to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Professor Ahmida is the 2010-2011 Lutke Chair of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of New England. He was born in Libya and educated at Cairo University in Egypt, so he's following the revolutionary trail, right? And he was also educated at the University of Washington in Seattle, but things are still quiet there, I think, in Seattle. His specialty is political theory, comparative politics, and historical sociology of power, agency, and anti-colonial resistance in North Africa, especially modern Libya. Professor Ahmida has also published major articles in Critique, in Arab Future, and in the International Journal of Islamic and Arabic Studies. He is also the author of The Making of Modern Libya, State Formation, Colonization, and Resistance. This is with Sunni Press, published in 1994. This book has been translated into Arabic and was published in a second edition by the Center of Arab Unity Studies in 1998. This is headquartered in Beirut, Lebanon. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Lahouari Addi first, and then Professor Ahmida second.
Thank you very much, Osama, and thank you, Elliot, for having me here to talk about the crisis of the authoritarian regime in the Arab world. And all of us, we have been surprised by these revolts, these uprisings, surprised because as scholars interested in Arab world, we knew that these authoritarian regimes in the Arab world were not viable in the long run, but no one could say when they will end, when they will collapse. And suddenly, as un château de cartes, as we say in French, they are falling apart one after the other. So, scholars like us try to explain the lack of democracy in the Arab world. Some of us were talking about civic culture, the lack of civic culture underpinning of democracy. And others spoke about the Arab exception. And all these academic certainties have been belied by these events. So I am going to divide my talk in three parts. I'm going to say some words about the historical origins of these regimes, and to put these events in a historical perspective, because we should bear in mind, we should keep in mind that these regimes, and I am talking only about the republics, the so-called progressist or socialist republics, Algeria, Egypt, even Tunisia in some way, Libya, Syria, Iraq. And I am not talking about the monarchies. They need an address by themselves. So in the 60s and the 50s, in the 50s and the 60s, these regimes were popular. So they had a kind of legitimacy. So I am going to talk in the first part about the origins of these regimes, and in the second part I will elaborate on the limits of the populist model, because they were built on a populist model. And finally, the third part, it will be an interpretation of mine. Interpretation, I interpret these revolts as a new stage of the Arab nationalism, but not Arab nationalism as pan-Arabism, not as ideology aiming at a unified Arab state. I think that the Arab word, Arab nationalism, expresses itself locally at a national level, and it's still strong. It's not like in Europe, for instance. Europe is in a stage of, we can say, post-national. Post-national. In the Arab world, nationalism is still strong. And you know what? In Algeria, for instance, the people, when they criticize the army, they say, yeah, of course, the half of the high-ranking officers come from the French army. How could they give us a lesson on nationalism? They used to belong, so it's still nationalism, and it's a new cycle. And this nationalism, it's my opinion, we can debate. This new stage is aiming at the rule of law, or at putting the executive branch under the control of the electorate in some way. The experience is beginning. I know that some will say that I am too optimistic. There are evidences which can make me optimistic. It's huge. In Arab world, a former president to be put in jail. It's a revolution for us. It's possible that it doesn't mean something important for American people or European people, but for us to put Ben Ali in exile, just like an outlaw, and he is asked to be brought into court. It's a revolution. So of course, democracy, electoral democracy will be set up. People are expecting a lot. They are expecting a lot. There will be disenchantment. There will be disenchantment, of course. But I think that in 3 or 4 or 5 years, this society will be better off in political matter. But they will be better off. I will tell you in which way they will be better off. And democracy will look like, just ask democracy in Eastern Europe, Mexico, or even Brazil or India. There, democracy didn't fix everything. But at least, I can tell you, in Algeria, in Egypt, if you go to a police station, you could be beaten by the police. You could be beaten. We had no dignity. So it's why this kind of, because I gave twice this talk, and in the debate, many people, colleagues, they were saying that I am optimistic. To get rid of the generals who killed thousands of people, who stole billions, it's huge for us. It's huge. Of course, Algeria won't be a superpower, or Egypt won't be a superpower. But to get rid of Mubarak, who is an obstacle to a development in Egypt, or to get rid of Ben Ali, it's huge for us. So, I am almost running out of time. I wanted to say first, in the first part of my talk, that these regimes stemmed from liberation movements in the 50s, or from coup in the 50s and 60s by the military, who gave themselves a sacred mission to modernize the country, to develop the economy on a non-capitalist way. And they had as mission to build a central power with an efficient administration and to unify the country politically. So I think that this aim was achieved. And this aim was achieved, and it has been carried out with a populist discourse. A populist discourse. When the three officers in Egypt took over by throwing away, or by throwing the monarchy, they made promises to bring the state closer to the working classes. They enacted a law, for instance, in the 50s, that gives the right to any student who graduates from university to be hired as civil servant. And jobs have been created. In Algeria, for instance, Colonel Lahouari Addi nationalized the oil from the foreign companies, and with the financial bonanza, he launched a great and ambitious industrialization program, and he created thousands of jobs in industry, in administration, in services. So these regimes in the 50s and the 70s, they met political and social expectations from the people. Now, it was under the military. The military played a political role, an important political role. They embodied the nation for two reasons. In North Africa, for Algeria, for instance, Morocco and Tunisia are exceptions. Algeria is a paradigmatic case. Violence has to be used to get independence because of colonial domination. And in the Middle East, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, the creation of Israel in 1948 politicized the armies. So, I mean, there are ideological and historical conditions that put forward in the political field the army. And the army, indirectly or directly, ran the state. Now, they used also the traditional political culture not to go back to the previous social order, but to strengthen the state power. In Syria, for instance, the Alawites are the majority of the high-ranking officers in the army. In Algeria, the Shawiya from the Ores, they were the majority of the high-ranking officers. It was the Asabiyat were used to prevent coup, not to go back to the previous social order. So the aim of these regimes at that time was to create a strong state power, and they set up two instruments, the single party and the political police, al-mukhabarat. The mission of the single party was to give the illusion that there is a political life stemming from the people who support the leader or the leaders. And the mukhabarat, the political police, its mission was to crack down with brutality, torturing and even murdering the opponents. So, by the end of the 70s, these regimes reached their limits. Let me remind you, in 1977, there were riots in Egypt. In 1978, riots in Tunisia. In 1980, riots in Algeria. In 1982, I guess it was in Syria, Hama. Even if they say, as today, they are Islamists and so. So these regimes lost their popular support by the end of the 70s. And during the 80s, they survived thanks to violence and also to either oil, Algeria, Libya, Iraq, or the financial aid from Western countries. So reforms had to be implemented, and they tried to survive by reforming. They introduced reforms. And you know what? It's not a coincidence. Tunisia was the first country or state to get rid of the socialist rhetoric. In 1969, Tunisia dismissed Ahmed Ben Salah, a former leader whose economic policy was the state-run economy. In 1974, Egypt got rid of the rhetoric, the socialist rhetoric. And other countries followed, and there were reforms. They tried to set up the market rules, but they didn't want to give up the use of economy as political resource. And here we had the first contradiction. And in Egypt, in Algeria, in Tunisia, and so, the people were undoing the flaws of both systems, socialism and capitalism. And the second point is that the economic reforms allowed the private investments. So there was at the end of the 70s and in the 80s, a new class, rich people, stemming from the reforms. But these economic reforms didn't work, didn't achieve their promises for two reasons. The first, the private sector didn't invest in productive activities, in production of material commodities. They invested in speculative activities. And the wealth was not coming from production, but from speculation. And the wealth was accumulated thanks to clientelistic networks rooted in the army, the administration, and the ruling party. So you have a new class, and you have or you don't have a judiciary system autonomous from the executive branch. So the result was the spread of corruption. It wasn't anymore forbidden to accumulate wealth. And you can accumulate wealth by any way. But since the judiciary system wasn't autonomous, the corruption spread in the state administration. And the regime or the state became more and more unpopular. The second observation I would like to make is that this new bourgeoisie, the concept of bourgeoisie is from Marx, and it has a precise content, theoretical and historical. I would say by bourgeoisie only rich classes, people who have money. There is no bourgeoisie in Arab society. There are people who have money. I would call them a monetary bourgeoisie. So this bourgeoisie is against democracy. The Arab bourgeoisie, the Arab rich classes, they are against democracy. Why? Because their wealth comes from the collusion, the support, the networks rooted in the state. So it's privileges. And with democracy, they would lose these privileges. So there was also political reform in the 80s, late 80s. In Egypt, it was late 70s. In Algeria, late 80s. And what was this political reform? It introduced more incoherence. They put an end to the single-party system, but they used to rig the elections. What does it mean to put an end to the single-party system and to rig the elections? And they shaped the political field such as there is no political party which could take over by elections. So what kind of pluralism or democracy is that? So at the economic level, it was incoherent, socialism or state-run economy and market, and political level, there was also incoherence, since the discourse was discourse of democracy. We are a democracy. The former contract between the state and the population was broken up. And what was the former contract? It was, we give you social rights, we meet your social expectations, but forget your political rights. It was the 50s and the 70s. So in the 80s, the state is not able anymore to meet all your expectations. If you want a job, housing, healthcare, ask the market, write to the market, send a letter to the market. And in counterpart, you will have the choice to choose, you will have the choice to elect any representative you want. Theoretically, it was this model. But the regimes of the personnel in office, they were not sincere. They didn't play the game. They didn't play the game genuinely. They wanted just to stay in office and with the market and without meeting the social expectations. So the regimes had to arrest on violence, and when you arrest on violence, violence could put an end to the regime. So now I would like to conclude. By the third part. I mean, I see this end of the authoritarian regime as a new cycle in Arab nationalism. The Arab world is currently in a revolutionary phase, and this phase is going to last some years, 3, 4, or 5 years, and after it will decline. And the regimes are just undergoing the events that are escaping them. Libya, Syria, and tomorrow Algeria, and so these revolts say in some way that in the eyes of the young people, of the young demonstrators, the rulers betrayed nationalism. It's why we see so many flags among the the protesters. And I am sure you noticed, people in Egypt, in Tunisia, they were chanting the national anthem, saying that you don't have the monopoly on nationalism. You betrayed nationalism. And it's why it's difficult to repress people who show such nationalism, because they used to repress people supposed to be a threat for the nation, supposed to be a threat for national unity. And it's the discourse of Gaddafi today and of Bashar al-Assad also. So in Egypt, in Tunisia, Ben Ali or Mubarak couldn't say that they are against the unity of Egypt or... So I think that nationalism is an ideological resource, and all the authoritarian regimes need an ideological resource for the survival. As soon as they don't have the control of it, they fall. They fall. So born out of peculiar conditions of colonizations, these regimes lost their historical relevance some decades later. They resisted in the 80s thanks to violence and to the financial resources coming from oil or international aid. They fulfilled their task, meaning the creation of the state power that politically unifies the nations. The rulers have been unable to envision the next step, that of the setting up of the rule of law. So the question to ask is why suddenly these regimes became fragile and they are now falling apart. To my knowledge, the answer is to be found in 4 directions. First, the ruling elites got accustomed to the social unrest and became insensitive to the plight of the population. The administration, the state administration, is undermined by corruption and embezzlement. And it doesn't seem concerned by the everyday conditions of life. So the population has the feeling that the rulers no longer care about social unrest. So there is a loss of trust and also a rejection of the regime by the majority. Second, the international environment has changed dramatically in a way that doesn't help the discourse of these regimes. The TV satellites and cell phones taking pictures make the use of violence against protesters more difficult. The NGOs are more present on the ground and alert the public opinion whenever human rights abuses are taking place. A statement by Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch is an encouragement to activists to resist arbitrarily. So room for maneuver is not as large as it was yesterday for these regimes based on the fear of their citizens. Third, the Islamists change, at least in the discourse. They change and they appear as victims of arbitrary and abuses in Tunisia, Egypt, and Algeria. In Algeria, during the 90s, thousands of Islamists were killed without trial, and some other thousands are missing. So the regime is hardly seen as a champion of liberties. Fourth, there is also an evolution within the army, which seems to be aware that it was protecting a corrupt regime. Remember, in Tunisia and in Egypt, the army didn't want to fire on demonstrators. Until now, the army was used as a political party identifying itself with the regime. I think that the new generations have understood that the army is an institution of a nation and not a tool of a regime. Some of them are attracted by the Turkish model, the Turkish army model, that accommodated itself with free elections and a government run by Islamists. In some words now, I would say that the Arab world is looking for a path to solve the contradictions of the privatization of the state. Arab nationalism in the 20th century was in search of a sovereign nation, and in the 21st century, it is in search of the rule of law. The rulers will pay a high price, exile, jail, trials, for having taken for granted the privatization of the state. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Addi. I will ask you to hold your questions to the end, and at the, if you don't mind. Thank you very much again. And I will now invite Professor Ahmida to come to the podium, and his talk is entitled Why Gaddafi Already Lost and the Ghosts of Libya's Colonial Past. Without further delay, please join me again. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I would like first I would like to say thank you to Professor Murshid, and also to my good friend Elliot Kola, who has worked all those months to help organize this, and I'm glad that it's a reality here. I'm going to start with a very short story. 5 years ago, I came here to give a talk about the politics of reform in Libya. At that time, there was a little bit, I was optimistically guarded, but nevertheless optimistic about the course of reform. And I tried to see how reform advocated from within things that we don't hear about Libyan literature, about Libyan activists, lawyers, organizations that have been working and pushing for that reform for quite a while. Well, the reform was crushed. And that's why I think we have a different phase. Now, some of you might know about Libya's colonial brutal history, but most people don't know, including many Arabs. And let me start with a statement. Colonialism in the 19th century and 20th century, even before that, was not a single monolithic experience or regime. And that's really across the board. But also, I think when it comes to the Arab world, the Algerian experience and the Libyan experience stand in their own. It would be really misleading to equate the colonization of Tunisia or Morocco or Egypt, for that matter, or Syria, or even Iraq, with what happened in Algeria or Libya. Now, Algeria, longer brutal colonization. Libya, short, but maybe one of the most brutal, and the whole history of colonialism in Africa. I think knowing that will help us understand and put the whole context of history so the past explain the present. Now, I have been following the news, as most of you are probably, and glued to Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and whatever TV station I could get hold of. And I developed an interest, a very weird interest. I began to write down all the slogans and try to figure out what kind of pictures people are raising. Professor Addi is right. A remarkable nationalist poet from southern Tunisia by the name of Abul Qasim al-Shabi, who was buried a long time ago, came out of his grave to hunt the regimes today. And his poems that we studied as children in Arab schools, they're coming back. And that's interesting. The other thing in the Libyan uprising, I noticed that the Libyan regime that had a monopoly over the anti-colonial heroes and histories that was suppressed for so long, and may explain the paranoia of Gaddafi earlier. It's not to the Libyan people. That in most towns and cities, people would raise the pictures of, for example, in the western Jabal Nufusa, the picture of Khalifa bin Askar was raised in Nalut. In Beloulit, the name and the picture of Abdel Nabi Belkhair, one of the 4 leaders of the Tripolitanian Republic, was raised. And above all, of course, Sheikh al-Shuhada Omar al-Mukhtar's picture, that was, the face of the Libyan regime under Gaddafi. For many years, he put it in his dress when he went to Italy. The Libyan currency had a picture of Omar al-Mukhtar. The heroic Sheikh is pictured everywhere in Libya. And the idea is that we are the heirs. We are, the descendants of Omar al-Mukhtar. We are the one who are really bringing legitimacy, dignity, and self-determination to the Libyan people. So the question of discourses and confronting the ghosts of that brutal history was naturally used by the Gaddafi regime. And interestingly, right now, the regime could not use it anymore. The uprising now, resurrecting those heroes, and Omar al-Mukhtar is no longer could be used by the regime. And the demonstrators in Al-Bayda, in Benghazi, and the rest of Libya, and his last statements are being quoted, his picture being raised again, and suddenly Omar al-Mukhtar is no longer, he doesn't belong to the current regime. Something went wrong. Now, if you want to know the real ghosts, I could tell you a little bit, but I don't want to scare you today. We want to make our exchange very pleasant. I could tell you a few, though. We know that the population of Libya in 1900 and the population of Tunisia was between 1 million to 1.5 million. Some scholars are saying that it was 1.5 million. According to the Ottoman census, it was, that range. They didn't count a lot of nomads. And it takes probably Ibrahim's novels to resurrect the real numbers and the real history of later on. But in 1950, the population of Tunisia was 2.5 million. Libya stayed 1 million. You could say that maybe they decided to go somewhere. That's a possibility. Or worse, that as we know, me and some of my Italian colleagues who works in this, we know that at least 500,000 perished directly or indirectly. And I know that at least in my own research in the last 10 years, visiting the concentration camps where the whole population of Eastern Libya was interned between 1928 and 1934, we know that only 35,000, 40,000 came alive. Now, this story was buried, completely buried and silenced. So when you talk about Libya, I laugh because they talk about Gaddafi and how weird and how eccentric he is, Libya's oil, and that whole colonial brutal history is somehow disappeared. I think Professor Addi is right. The colonial question is with us. I wouldn't say the nationalist question or Arab nationalist. I would say the colonial question with us. Now, the contribution of this generation, a wonderful generation of, the young and men and women who are leading these courageous uprisings, is that they are pushing the envelope to a new level. It's not just colonial vendetta or colonial shouting. It's also concrete demands and concrete goals against absolutism, against dictatorship, against corruption, and a specific thing, and above all, for dignity. I laugh when they say the Tunisian Revolution is Jasmine. I think that's a silly name. It was for dignity. It wasn't just for something French fashionable thing, say, you know, this is Jasmine, and oh, the Arabs, this is the, you know, the revolt of the Arabs, as if that's really Lawrence of Arabia coming back to us. This is, I think, a needed introduction to, so I could, you know, situate what I'm going to say here to you, and I promise to not to go for long. Me and Ibrahim came from southern Libya, and we came from long genealogies of storytelling, so hopefully I will not abuse your patience. Now, there is a question here for us. The regime that toppled the monarchy in 1969 was popular, led by military officers who came from middle and mostly lower middle class background, and it was it brought the colonial, anti-colonial trauma to the open. One would ask, what happened during the monarchy between 1951 and 1969? The whole colonial trauma, the whole colonial genocide, to be blunt, was kind of quieted, because Libyan independence was major achievement to the Libyan people, but also was compromised because it has to be limited, it has to be dominated by English and also American interests. And one of the compromises is that you quiet and you don't talk about the horrors of the colonial period. This is about modernization and modernity and stability. Gaddafi's and the junior officer who came in '69, when they vented, which is sometimes craziness, made no sense to the outside world. But the vast majority of ordinary Libyans made a lot of sense. It's my time to vent. Nobody cared about us. Nobody listened to us. Nobody even, said anything about even the history books or scholarship. So this is time we want to vent and express our outrage about what happened to us. Now, the regime, of course, went through stages. It did not stay the same. It also, but the legitimacy and the discourses that brought was very crucial, and Gaddafi's leadership was important in one sense. He really was brilliant and astute in really creating a language of populism where the anti-colonial sentiment and rage and wounds was articulated as an ideology for the regime on populist ideology. That's really the very, very brilliant way of articulating that, and created a state populist ideology, at least for the first 10 or 15 years. Now, the question is, of course, and I addressed that in an op-ed piece a month ago, or 4 weeks ago, but I'll just touch on it a little bit. What went wrong? I think that's a very, very important question. The regime, however, articulated in its social base the interests of the anti-state sentiment of central and southern Libya, people of the hinterland. Now, keep in mind, Libya in 1950 was still controlled by rural forces. Let me elaborate a little bit. Libya is huge in terms of size. And it has major regions. But historically speaking, contrary to Tunisia, to Egypt, to Syria, to Iraq, the country, the forces, the rural forces were more dominant and more organized than the urban areas. Tripoli became dominant only at the last phase of the colonial period. Gaddafi and the junior officers, and before them King Idris, also came from the countryside. they really, continue to give us the pattern that dominated state-society relations in Libya. And the ideology, the language of anti-state, the populist, the refusal to build stronger state, all of these things were built earlier about these, social traditions that continued up until let's say the middle of the 20th century. Now, what's interesting, and this is my main thesis here, or argument, if you like to say, for the first time, Libyan society today, which is more urban, had the highest literacy rate now and maybe in the region. This is really remarkable, because it used to be one of the most backward and poorest when it comes to infrastructure, economic service, and other things. And in a way, this revolution or uprising is urban-based, not rurally based as Gaddafi's older regime. So in terms of social composition, not only the regime became isolated to his own sons, his own cousins, his own maybe followers among certain regions, sub-region in Libya, and his own paid mercenaries, whether that are from the African continent, the Arab world, or Europe, and a part of Latin America. Actually, this uprising was led by urban youth. And in that sense, in terms of social composition, it's a different kind of uprising. Now, let me now be more specific and share with you how to maybe spill out that argument. If we theorize this uprising and apply a framework that was brought to us by major scholars of modern revolution, whether that Barrington Moore Jr., Jim Scott, or people like Jacques Goldstone and other scholars who have dealt even with the question of modern class structure, regions, agency, and an autonomy, and also the ability to organize against absolutist and dictatorial regimes or not. In other words, that how to really be concrete instead of just saying, oh, there is this and there is that, and be open-ended. Let's start by saying a few things about when the crisis of the state began, and also when the elite began to alienate it from the regime. And then after that, how people who were alienated from the regime began to agitate against it, lost all hope in reform. And then they began to mobilize themselves. And what kind of ideologies, what kind of resources available to them, what kind of institution available to them that they mobilize to challenge a regime as powerful, as nasty as these Arab regimes that had no tolerance whatsoever against dissent, not to mention any minor critique, where the presidents are almost like shadow of gods on earth, in that sense. Now, I think here, let me share with you the following. When it comes to the crisis of the state or the regime in that sense, we have a number of factors that contribute to the crisis, and I would trace the crisis as far as the mid-80s. And here we are talking about the defeat, the military defeat in Chad that the regime never recognized until this day. We're talking about 10,000 Libyan who were volunteer folks who were asked to fight in Chad, and they were killed there, or some of them had to run into exile, and they were exploited by the CIA, unfortunately, later on. So that's really the loss of nationalist credentials. That would be the first one. The Lockerbie crisis, another humiliating source of loss of nationalist credentials, and also the the failing of the public institutions, where Libyans, instead of the great Jamahiriya, which is supposed to be a paradise on earth with a lot of oil, couldn't really afford even treating their own citizen for medicine, and also public institution began to decay. They would go to neighboring capitalist Tunisia for treatment, and they would have to sell their own jewelry and borrow money to be treated there. And the sons of the great leader will spend millions of dollars just having birthday parties or Christmas parties, you know, and they would have Beyonce and Usher and Mariah Carey and others giving them, you know, wonderful parties for that. So I think loss of national credential is one factor important, and that began earlier. The sanctions really strengthened the state and weakened the people. The sanctions really were miserable as far as the Libyan people are concerned. The second factor that's also very, very important to keep in mind is to look at, you know, you could have problems. You could really not be able to deal with politics, but I think ordinary people, either middle or you know, lower class, you know, in Libya, like the region, if they're at least their economic and social lives are still functioning, I think not everybody's going to march in the streets. But then when the elite began to be alienated, that's the first seed. And I'm talking about various groups. We're talking about the ulama, were purged and some even murdered. Merchants were attacked. Liberals, including you know, writers, were also either imprisoned or harassed. Students who are the avant-garde, and I was one member of that student movement in Cairo when I was a student there, and I think in Libya too. They were arrested, the leaders, they were imprisoned, some even hanged in public. And Libyan socialists and leftists also were imprisoned. I'll give you one example that some of you might be aware of. I have around 15, 20 friends, writers, the most creative writers, who, you know, talking about poets, short story writers, stage and theater writers that many Ibrahim knows also, were accused of toppling a conspiracy to topple the regime. And those 23 writers, one of the most, I would say, brilliant writers, they were put in prison for 10 years. Now, of course, they are back, and some of them are leading in the uprising, and their memoirs and their poems and their short stories are really hunting the regime finally. They were also the first one who hoped that reform could take place before it was shot. And we specifically we're talking about groups like lawyers, not necessarily just the intellectuals and the writers. We're talking about doctors, academics, women organizations. All of these groups were incorporated in the state, and either you are dealing with, you know, you are with the believe in the slogans of the regime, or you are really anti-revolutionary and even reactionaries. Just to give you the idea, one time the ideologues around Gaddafi thought even in the United States it should be the system should be changed to revolutionary committees. Okay, I know time is running, so I'm going to hurry a little bit so we'll have time to ask questions. Let me just add the sources of mass mobilization. We are talking about the organization that began to gain momentum when the regime made peace with the Western governments and with the UN. And that gave them a little bit of a margin. So the writers began to write more. I was involved with some of my friends in an experiment called Arajin, a cultural journal that came twice a year. I think Libyan novelists, not only Ibrahim, but also others, they began to write novels that began to really challenge the narrative of the state and the official history of the state. Also, we're talking about lawyers began to reorganize again. And we began to see youth also having their own version that began to challenge the state itself. Interesting that citizens media, the social media that Professor Addi spoke about, it's really true. Even in Libya, they used it very, very effectively. And when they were shut, social media was shut off. They even go to Egypt and Tunisia to connect, and there was a lot of collaboration between people. But the irony is, up until maybe 3-4 years ago, most Libyan opposition, the coalition that made of liberals, Islamists, socialists, human rights activists, academics, all these groups that are now making the coalition that's challenging the regime, they were willing to give the reform a chance. The regime committed 2 sins. Was stupid, dumb mistakes and sins. First, Gaddafi came, as probably you know, and said that Ben Ali should be in heck. The Tunisians are in such a hurry. They could wait a few months, maybe years. Heck, he should be president for life. And he was talking to Libyans, actually, not to Tunisians. So that really incensed people. Second thing, when his son, the reformist PhD from London School of Economics, came and gave this really, awful, almost kind of a fascist speech. Either you are with us, or colonialists are going to come to you, or we're going to burn Libya. As if it's really his piece, he and his father's, Libya's a piece of property. What happened is more defections. The people who were reformers within the regime are leading now. Some of them are the transitional Libyan council in Benghazi. And you could also see that when the reform was shut off, people thought this regime is not reformable. We cannot save the country and do it through a peaceful, gradual change. And what you see, not only the famous reformers, military officers, diplomats began to defect in a large number. And we saw the most daring, courageous young men and women that faced the regime, as we have seen in the city of Misrata, the city of Zawiya, in the Jabal, and also in other parts of the country, where we thought this generation is soft. This generation will never do much of work. They are alienated, they are not educated, they are not conscious. And we were all proven wrong, because this courage and this determination and this clarity and also creative thinking was absolutely unbelievable. Now what we have is the shape of revolutionary struggle. Now there is no one leader, and actually I'm happy about that. For one time in the Arab world we have something, not the great Zaim. Damn the great Zaims. They brought us corruption and dictatorships and everything. Actually, it's so refreshing to see people who are really citizens, who are talking about jobs, about concrete goals, about concrete representations, and also specific goals. This is a qualitative change that we weren't paying attention to. And that's very, very important thing to keep in mind. Let me now conclude by saying the following. It would be misleading and naive, or maybe idealistic, to assume that these wonderful uprisings that now caught the whole world's attention are going to succeed automatically. I think if one thing we learn from history, things can go forward, but also things go backward. We don't have to remember the only awful scenarios of the one time the most promising Arab society, Iraq, or the peripheral country of homogeneous country like Somalia or others, or the ongoing crisis in Algeria that has been going on there. So things could go wrong, and we shouldn't be surprised about that. Now there are threats to these uprisings, and the threats I could share with you. In my opinion, there are few. One is foreign agendas. I don't think Mr. Sarkozy gives a hoot about democracy, and he's marching himself as a new champion of democracy. I don't believe it. Heck, the French state hasn't even recognized the horrors of Algeria. And now suddenly they want us to believe that's the case. So I think this is very, very important to understand that there are agendas that might try to say payback. And that's very important. I think in Libya, the generation of the 40s made a horrible mistake. Libyan independence is tremendous. That's why Libyan people are waving the independence flag. But also that generation made some mistakes. That could happen again if you are naive and you say that military intervention is going to resolve the case for you. That will be the last. That will be disastrous in Libya. Absolutely disastrous. Second, the role of exiled. If the Iraqi, exiled role in Iraq was by now disastrous, in my opinion. Libyan right-wing opposition exiled groups are positioning themselves as if they are going to go back to the old 50s. That would be disastrous as well. But furthermore, what we need to do by learning about these societies and their own social histories, not the state, we need to really pay attention to these societies themselves and rediscover them. And above all, I think what we need to, what worries me is, one thing is to say I'm against a dictator. The hardest thing is going to be how to build accountable representative republics. That's going to be very hard and messy. And I hope that the lessons of Iraq and Somalia will be learned so much that existing institutions will not be destroyed, including the police, the banks, the trade unions, the universities, because they were part of a dictatorial regime. That's another lesson. But this is a wonderful challenge. Libya, in a way, is a very sad, because over 10,000 or 15,000 people are being murdered now by this regime that's morally bankrupt and has no more legitimacy inside Libya. But Libya might be easier than Egypt, in my opinion. For one reason, I don't think the Egyptian ruling class is going to just step aside and say, okay, khalas, let's hug and kiss and everything is going to be okay. That's not going to happen unless we don't understand Egyptian ruling class. Or in the case of Tunisia, where the poor and the marginalized in the south and in the east causes which started the revolution now are taken by the middle class and the other groups who are agitating in Tunis. I'll stop here.
Thank you both for your very engaging and instructional talks. I now open the floor to questions. If you don't mind identifying yourself. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Felix Mihails with the Aspen Institute. I have questions more related to France foreign policy in North Africa. With the democratization taking place in some of this country, is the influence of France likely to decrease because it has less the collapse of this client state?
You are asking about the influence of France over North Africa. You are asking if with this political change, this influence would decrease or increase?
Decrease.
I think that people there focused on internal dynamics. And they have the feeling, it's a true or false feeling, it's another problem. But they have the feeling that the regimes, they are not serving the country, they are serving only their survival. So when, for instance, the Algerian regime agrees with France, they let France to have businesses and to open cultural centers in Algeria. But when they are there is a problem, they break down, they cut off so the people, they have the feeling that the foreign policy has no strategy or deep strategy. It's just to how can I say, to satisfy the immediate interests of the regime. Algeria now has no foreign policy. I mean no foreign policy, visible, coherent. And they, mostly they lie. For instance, the position toward the events in Libya. We know, everyone knows, that Algeria is helping Gaddafi. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he says, no, we are not helping Gaddafi. We are helping the people in Libya, and we are fearing that France, the NATO would intervene in North Africa, and so on. So there is no consistent foreign policy, either in Tunisia with Ben Ali, Mubarak with Egypt, Algeria with Bouteflika, and so on. Now, the West, Europe, the United States, as we know, the international arena is, as Hobbes put it, the state of nature. It's conflicting, and they are trying to have more influence in some way or another. But the response of the Arab regimes are weak, and they are not appropriate. I don't know if I answered, but it's my opinion.
Can I just add one
Yeah.
quick comment? I think this is a very, very important question. I think the way I think about it as follows. In one sense, we have to remember that, unfortunately, French policy and American policy have been motivated by security concerns and also national security concerns. And not only this, they actually, we have to put that in historical context. They were not bystanders or neutral observers. The Tunisian regime was hailed by the French government for a long time as a model for the region. And it was protected, it was encouraged as the model for the rest of the continent, African continent, and the southern Mediterranean. In the case of Egypt, as we know, even though we had academics and media, critics of the regime in the United States, the official policy in the White House has been always to regard the Mubarak regime as really an important, stable government that's an ally in the fight against terrorism and Islamic extremism, and also in the relationship with Egypt. So I think we need to really remember that it's not true that the French and the American policies toward the region were just on the sideline, and suddenly now they're cheering for democracy. I had to say this is completely inaccurate. I think we hope that as the scholars in France, as scholars in the United States, and people began to raise the question about the people, that the foreign policy will not become just has amnesia about what happened in the past, and instead of always looking at the question of stability and the question of national security, but look at the fact that people are not submissive, are not Orientals, they are capable of articulating the same universal demands as people in France and people in the United States. And I think at that point, then the question of listening to people will come, and we hope that will revise power relations. This is an idealist image, but I think we need to set the record straight about, we have nothing to do with this.
Joseph Soon, Georgetown University. To what extent both of you think that the durability of this regime is, one, due to the success of the single-party system to co-opt large segment of the population, even in the 80s and the 90s, through an extensive system of rewards? And my second question is about the role of the cult of personality in those regimes, to what extent also it played to extend the durability.
The first part of the question. I don't see the single party rewarded large sections of the population during the 80s. I will take just an example. And I think it's a good example because in Tunisia, the ruling party used to have, or it claimed to have, 2 million adherents. 2 million adherents. A population of 10 million. It means that 5 million of the Tunisians are adults. It means that almost the half of the population of Tunisia were members of the RCD. So where were they when the young people were demonstrating? So the population tried to use the single party to have some protection of some favor or some privileges. But it wasn't genuine, it wasn't supportive of the regime. Now, the second part of the question. The founding fathers, if I can use this expression, Nasser, Colonel Boumediene, Bourguiba, they had, as I tried to show, a kind of legitimacy because they were the expression of nationalism at that time, 50s and 60s. But they didn't have around them a political leader who could succeed them and of their dimension. They were not democratic. They were not Democrats. They used a word, an expression by Clemenceau, the French politician. Clemenceau said, if a leader wants to shine, he needs to have around him people mediocre. I would say in French, si un chef veut briller, il faut qu'il s'entoure d'imbéciles. And you know, around Nasser, around Boumediene, around Bourguiba, there were only imbeciles. You know, Chadli Bejdid, who succeeded Boumediene, he didn't know to write or to read, neither in Arabic nor in French. And the young people were laughing at him, saying that he is bilingual illiterate. I want to say that the founding fathers, they were sincere, they were militants. You know, Bourguiba used to identify himself with Tunisia. You know, when he died, the Tunisians realized that he didn't have a home, a personal home. He didn't have a personal bank account. Ben Ali has $5 billion. So, the first generation, it was political leaders. The second generation, it was civil servants. Civil servants who tried to take advantage of the heritage. And they were only opportunistic. It's why they are not, they don't have charisma. They don't have charisma. As you know, when Nasser resigned, Colonel Nasser resigned in 1967. Thousands of Egyptians pulled the street to ask him to stay in power. And when he died, he left behind no fortune. So I think that the first generation, they were political men, with their flaws, but they were political men. The second generation, it's like Ibn Khaldun cycle. The second generation, it wasn't. There was no personality.
Let me just add to what Dr. Addi said. I think it's important not to look at the crisis now and assume that existed the same earlier. That's really, in terms of history, that's not very, very true. Regimes were popular earlier, and then they declined, and their social base changed, and other factors were at display here. I think for example, earlier in the 1950s and 1960s, there was some euphoria. Of course, this is coming out of the colonization. I think democracy was not really the primary goal. We're talking about really the right for self-determination. And earlier generations thought that's going to happen because you want to modernize and you want to have all your own self-determination. And the other thing that's important, the mobilizing the people was very, very, very important. But the question of literacy, education, infrastructure, healthcare, were really important to many generations. I was born after independence in Libya, and I know that for my parents that was very, very important that we go to school. I think they didn't debate at home whether we should have democracy or not. They wanted everybody to have school, have medical care and opportunity better than them. So I think the context at that time was very, very important. But I think Professor Addi is right about one thing. Within that context, it's not fatal. When you have good role model, it helps. And the Arab world, we are short of good role models, where somebody, like Mandela, say, I'm going to be elected for one term and then goodbye. I'm going to retire and be a celebrity. Even populist figures like Boumediene, or Nasser, or Gaddafi, who earlier was really popular not only in the Arab world, in Africa too. When you stay 42 years in power, that's inevitable. I think that that corrupts the regime, and you become acting like you own the whole country, as his daughter was saying today in the paper. Libya belongs to us, and we owe it as a piece of property. So I think contextualizing these regimes is very important, and not to just stay in the surface. Oh, this guy is crazy. This guy is really insane. This guy is really senile. I think we need still to do the heavy work with what about society, who supported who was behind who, and how we understand politics and history and culture. That sometimes escapes our analysis.
Cultural anthropologist here. And I think we get a lot in the media, sort of the North Africa and its relationship to Europe and its relationship to the Arab world, in both the Arabic media and in the European and American press. But I see much less about moving south and the relationship of North Africa, but particularly Libya, to the sub-Saharan African countries, and what is going to happen with the fall of Gaddafi, because he has supported so many regimes and revolutionary movements and all sorts of people, and all of the migration and immigration that is coming out. And I know that's one of the things that Gaddafi threatened Europe with was, we'll open up our doors and make Southern Europe black, and by letting in the immigration. So could you maybe talk about that sort of subject, because I think it gets lost.
Absolutely. Actually, I just had a book. It came out, and Eliot had a chapter. I kept after him for almost a year until he finished a chapter on that. It's called Bridges Across the Sahara. It's about the trans-Saharan, international trade, And it looks about the Libyan social, economic, and cultural ties to the Sahara and West Africa. So that might be useful to you. But let me say two things in responding to your question. The first thing is Libyan social history, Libyan society, maybe even more than neighboring Maghrebian countries, is very connected to the Sahara and West Africa, historically speaking. And I can give you 3 examples. The trade, migration, the state of Awlad Muhammad in southern Libya, and the wonderful modernist social movement, the Senusiyya, that tied all these groups, North African and Saharans and West African, together in its institutions, in its education, and its scholars together. And so Gaddafi actually is not inventing. People think that he's inventing that. He's manipulating some things now. But there is a pattern in Libyan social history that you cannot ignore the depth and the connection with the Sahara and West Africa, as far as northern Nigeria. So, but what he did, the regime did, in its heydays, when it was a third world revolutionary regime, they supported nasty regimes like Idi Amin and Lawrence Taylor and others, but also supported South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia. And even when I went to South Africa, they told me, Ali, Libya was even better than the Soviet Union in the fight against apartheid. So we have to set the record straight there. That's why many Africans view the regime in a different way. Now, after the regime became more dictatorial, more isolated, the regime began to manipulate and use it as a way to break the isolation by the Western government and also the UN. But also, ironically, the regime built on the reservoir and the network and the history and the connections and the a network of social and cultural ties between Libya and West Africa. And Gaddafi inherited the Senusiyya network. Gaddafi inherited the Awlad Muhammad network, and also the very, very elaborate migration and mixing that existed for maybe 300, 400 years. And later on began to use it to stay in power. And I don't like when they say in our media, African mercenaries. Some Libyan use it. I think this is a really awful term. You should say, supporters from Mali, Chad, Niger, Algeria, Ukraine, Colombia, what have you. But to single out Africans as mercenary, as of North African, they are not in a different continent. So that's very, very, very important to keep in mind as we talk about that. And I think, in conclusion, Libya's ties to the rest of Africa and the whole idea of Africa, sub and north of the Sahara, to me, always, I wrote about it quite a bit, is completely, a big myth. It's going to continue after Gaddafi, because the history is still alive and cannot be excluded because the regime is dying.
Sharif Al-Musa, I teach in Doha, Georgetown, Doha. My question is, how did it happen that the uprising became militarized? It seemed like somehow in the rest of the Arab countries, they have it. I mean, like in Yemen until now, in Syria, in Egypt. And this seems to be the more successful model. So how did these, the people who were leading the uprising, did they fall into a trap? Did they make a mistake? Was that the only choice? How did it happen? Because these were army officers who knew the regime. I mean, they knew they don't have trained people really to confront the regime. So how did it? I don't understand how this happened. Was that the only choice? What happened exactly?
Well, the regime panicked. Because there was a very simple event. The regime had one of its ugliest action were 2. One is the massacre, the Busili massacre in 1996, where 1,000 200 political prisoners were murdered in cold blood by Gaddafi's brother-in-law, Colonel Abdullah Sanusi. So that was the thing. The second thing is the Italian consulate in Benghazi in February 17th, 2006 was attacked by people for colonial reason. Remember that Berlusconi minister who put the cartoons of the Prophet in his T-shirt. He and I think made a very, very enticing and also provocative speeches about Islam. That really hit that region, and that's the region that lost, as I said earlier, almost 60,000 people. So every family had somebody, grandmother or grandfather, who probably died in the camps. They attacked the consulate. The Libyan police retaliated and shot at them and killed around 10. That became that's why commemorating that event became really the case. So there is a history of, a violent, forceful suppression of dissent. Now the regime, when the families began to ask for more answer, more justice for the one who were killed in the massacre, the brigades shot at them, and they killed around 25 or so, and that enraged people. And Abdullah Sanusi thought that the army could be used as they did it before. So in short, without giving you a detailed history of these events, the regime thought always you give people social carrot, social advantages, incorporate them in a certain way, but you hit hard for people who oppose you. And they thought they could do it this time too. What happened is they didn't calculate that people were so enraged, they attacked the garrisons, and some officers joined them, and the whole eastern region, which has long grievances, became really off limits to the regime. Then after that, the regime made another mistake, which instead of saying, let's negotiate, let's have the reform idea, we promise you a constitution, other things that we were talking about, they said no. These are drug addicts, these are Al-Qaeda stooges, and these also are agents. And then after that, it got worse. The discourses got worse. They say they are rats. And when you brand somebody rat, the next thing is you want to crush them, or cockroaches. So the regime really brought that kind of reaction. People began to say, enough. There's nothing you could do about it. They're going to kill us. And if he had a chance, he's going to murder thousands of us. So that's why the context of Libya is different.
If you, I would like just to add some words. We have to look at the differences between, let's say, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia. These regimes, they have political armies. But there are armies that are more political than others. The Libyan army is much less institutionalized than the Egyptian army or the Tunisian army. The Libyan army is headed by allies, family ties, or the sons of Gaddafi. So they are more faithful to Gaddafi. It's Gaddafi's army. While in Tunisia or in Egypt, it's, we like it or not, the nation's army. And I think that here lies the difference. In Algeria, it could have been like Tunisia or Egypt, but since the army was involved in mass killings in the 90s, so the army will not want a change. The army, I think, will defend the regime, and it will it will be violent, just as Libya. And Syria is the same scenario.
Yeah. By the way, the Libyan army was dissolved, Dr. Sharif, after 1988. There is no Libyan army anymore. So there are security brigades.
Groups.
Yes.
Yeah.
You had a question?
Yes, I had several questions.
We don't have, it's going to have to be a brief question
Okay.
because these gentlemen have a dinner reservation.
Okay, I'll make it short then. I guess they're sort of related. The first one is Professor Ahmida. Earlier you mentioned that looking at the Libyan exile groups, we should be cautious of any of the ones that are calling for a return to the 1950s. I believe that was the term that you used.
Yes.
Are any of those sort of figures going back into Libya? Are they returning? Is that what they're calling for? And also looking at the structure of who has supported what when. How do we know how to be able to judge support for the revolution in Libya, in Tripoli, in Sirte, in Sabha, and how would they be incorporated into this movement?
Okay. The first question is, I think I'm having the infamous case of Ahmed Chalabi and his associates. I think it's very well studied and very well known about the role they played in inflating a lot of things that turned to be just lies about the situation in Iraq. So now in the Libyan situation, we're talking about two problems with the exiled Libyans. But the first one is that many of these exiled Libyans have been here for a long time. They haven't known Libya for a long time. And they're thinking of Libya, they have nostalgia about Libya before Gaddafi, which is maybe nice, and we have to respect the sentiment of everybody. But as far as really Libya, first of all, the monarchy, even though it was more peaceful than the regime in '69, it has a lot of corruption, it has a lot of flaws as well. The second thing is that many of these groups worked, not only they didn't know much about Libya, they worked with the CIA, they worked with other foreign government, they have their own vision of what might be the solution in Libya, and they really, they think that because they suffered and they stayed outside for a long, long time, then they are entitled to lead. Some of them went back, and some are still here, but they are very visible. And I want to be very clear, I think, you have to respect everybody in post-Gaddafi's Libya. But another thing one thing to respect people and their right to express themselves and their vision. Another thing is to try to impose agenda, especially military intervention in Libya, and try to really push for that, because you think that this is really, you're going to form the new government or a new alternative in Libya. That worries me, and I think I learned that people in Libya who should be deciding these things, not the exiled community, whatever their background is. As far as the groups who were with Gaddafi, very briefly, I'll give you, imagine that the regime was very popular. Right now, he could not even trust his own king group. His sons have to be there, and not only, he has to rely on mercenaries as well. There are groups in Sirte who are from his own king group, and in Sabha, not all Sabha, this is where I grew up, some of them there. But people are also nervous. There are people even who belong to his own king group who are really marginalized, but people are nervous. What's going to happen to us if Gaddafi goes? What about these guys who claim to lead us into this? They turn to be something nasty as Somalia or Iraq. Genuine anxiety is true in Libya, but the regime's social base is so limited and so narrow now that he has to rely on outsiders.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so please join me once again in thanking Professors Addi and Professor Ahmida.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you all both for for attending. Thanks very much.